The winter of 1881, deep in the valley country of Colorado, a 17-year-old girl walked 12 miles alone through rain and mud to find a carpenter she had no reason to trust. She carried a truth in her chest that could ruin her family's name before spring. She did not know if the man would stay or run. She did not know if love was what it had felt like that night in October, or only what she had told herself afterward to make it bearable. What she could not have known, because he had never written to say so, was that Caleb Mercer had spent every evening since leaving Ash Creek bent over a workbench in a rented room above a feed store, shaping a pine cradle with his hands. Not because he was certain, not because he had been told anything, but because he hoped, and because hope for a man like Caleb was not a thing he spoke aloud. It was a thing he built. This is their story. A tale of a woman who walked toward the truth when she could have hidden from it, and the quiet man who had already decided to be worthy of her before she ever arrived at his door. Elsie Whitaker was 84 years old the November afternoon her great-granddaughter asked about the cradle. It sat in the front room of the old house, as it always had, in the corner near the window where the light came in slanted and pale through the bare cottonwood branches. The wood was pine, gone honey-dark with age, smooth in the places where many hands had gripped the rail and many small fingers had wound around the spindles. There was no name carved on it, no date, no decoration of any kind except the gentle curve of the headboard, shaped like a cupped palm. The girl was 7 years old and practical in the way of children who have grown up around useful things. "Why don't you ever put it away?" she asked. "It doesn't do anything now." Elsie was quiet for a long while. Outside, the last of the afternoon light pulled itself thin across the yard. "Some things don't need to do anything," she said at last. "They already did everything." The girl looked at the cradle with the frank skepticism of a child who has not yet learned what it costs to lose something. Elsie looked at it with the steadiness of a woman who has carried a thing for 67 years and no longer feels its weight because it has become part of her bones. "There is a story," Elsie said, "about how that cradle came to be in this house before I did." The girl sat down on the rug without being asked, and Elsie went back. The year was 1881. Ash Creek Valley lay in the lower country west of the mountain passes, a place where the soil ran thin, but the families ran stubborn, and the winters arrived without ceremony and stayed past their welcome. The Whitaker homestead sat on 22 acres of ground that Thomas Whitaker had fought into productivity over nearly 2 decades, one fence post and one dry summer at a time. Now, Elsie was 17, and she understood the shape of her future the way you understand a room you have lived in too long. She could see every corner without looking. There were 3 kinds of lives for a woman in Ash Creek. You married a local man, someone your father found acceptable, and you became the next version of your mother. You left for somewhere a school teacher was needed. If you were lucky enough and the timing was right and some church organization was willing to pay the travel. Or you stayed unmarried, useful, and slowly became the kind of person the family referred to as a help around the house until the word help fell away and you became invisible. Elsie had read enough to want more than the room allowed. Not wealth, not ease, something harder to name. A life where the thinking she did by lamplight at night connected to something real in the morning. Her father was a fair man who did not understand ambition in a daughter because no one had ever asked him to. Her mother, Miriam, was a frontier woman who had traded her own wanting for endurance so long ago she had mostly made peace with the exchange. Her younger sister Grace was 12 and still believed that the world was a place where things worked out if you were good enough, which is the sweetest kind of wrong a child can be. Then there was Nathan Reed. Nathan was the son of the largest ranch holder in the valley. He was 23, well-dressed by local standards, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He had begun to appear at church suppers near Elsie's family, to stop by the farm on pretense of business with her father, to direct his conversation toward her with a calibrated attention that looked like interest but felt, when she sat alone afterward and pressed her memory of it, like appraisal. He never said anything that could be called rude. He never said anything either that made her feel like a person rather than a property he was considering. Thomas Whitaker did not push, but the valley pushed for him quietly through every neighbor who remarked what a solid match that would be, and every Sunday where Nathan managed to sit one row closer. Elsie watched the fall come in, red and gold and then brown, and waited to feel something other than the particular dread of a future already chosen for her. Caleb Mercer arrived in September with the harvest hands, one of 4 men Thomas hired when his own sons were not enough and the wheat needed cutting before the rains. He came from Missouri, which was far enough to be interesting without being suspicious. He was 22. He had a quiet face and hands that bore the layered calluses of a man who had worked at several crafts and settled into one. He slept in the small room off the barn. He ate at the family table without speaking much. He did not try to be charming. He was simply present and steady and good at what he was asked to do, which was enough for Thomas and more than enough for Elsie, who had grown tired of men who performed competence rather than demonstrated it. She noticed him first at the end of the 2nd week, after supper, when the light had dropped and the others had gone inside. He sat on the back step of the cabin with a book balanced on his knee. The book was thin and clearly old, its spine broken and repaired with a strip of cloth. The lamp from the kitchen window threw just enough light over his shoulder for reading. His blistered hands turned the pages with a kind of care that did not match the roughness of them. She did not speak to him that evening. She stood inside the doorway and watched the way his lips moved slightly on certain lines, the way a person does when the words are worth tasting. And she thought, here is someone who lives somewhere inside himself that the rest of the valley can't reach. The weeks that followed built slowly, the way trust builds when no one is trying to manufacture it. He fixed a fence rail she had mentioned to her father twice. He showed Grace how to splice a broken leather strap without making a fuss of the lesson. He read to himself in the evenings and never once asked if Elsie had noticed. She had noticed. He had noticed her, too, in the way a careful person notices things without drawing attention to the noticing. The way she read the farm ledger to her father and kept her voice level, even on the pages where the numbers were bad. The way she added an extra portion to the hired men's plates without making them feel like charity cases. The way she answered Nathan Reed's visits with a precise and flawless courtesy that gave nothing away and cost her something every time. One evening in October, he said without looking up from his book, "You don't want him." Elsie stopped on the step. She had not known he was watching. "That's not your concern," she said. "No," he agreed. He turned a page. "It isn't." She went inside, but she stood at the window a moment longer than she needed to. The storm came in the 1st week of November, hard and fast out of the north, the kind that flattened the dry grass and turned the yard to mud inside an hour. Thomas and Elsie's older brother rode out to check the south fence. Miriam had gone to town 3 days earlier to help a neighbor woman through a difficult birth. Grace was at the schoolhouse, which had held its session that morning before the sky went dark. The cabin held Elsie and the hired man. There was nothing improper in that, not at first. She brought coffee to the barn where he was working, because the cold had turned bitter and it was what her mother would have done. He thanked her without ceremony. Later she brought bread because the hour had stretched on and it seemed wasteful not to. By late afternoon the rain was drumming the roof in earnest and the wind had taken on a voice, and she said there was no reason to stay in the barn getting cold when there was a fire in the kitchen. He came in. They sat at the table. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows, and the lamp swayed on its hook. They talked for nearly 3 hours. He told her about his mother, a schoolteacher in Missouri who had died of fever when he was 14. She had taught him to read before he could properly hold a pencil, had put books in his hands the way other mothers put tools. He had kept the poetry volume because it was hers, because certain lines in it still sounded like her voice, though he could not have explained that to most people without feeling foolish. He told her about Pine Crossing, a town 2 days' ride north, where a cabinet maker named Alden Briggs had offered him a place learning the trade properly. Real joinery, furniture that lasted. He had deferred the offer for the harvest wages, which he needed, but he meant to go in the spring. Elsie told him she had never been further from Ash Creek than the county seat. She told him this without apology, though it had always been a thing she was ashamed of, the smallness of the circle she had lived inside. "There's a shop in Pine Crossing," he said, almost as an aside, "that sells second-hand books, good ones." It was not a promise. He may not have intended it as one, but Elsie heard in it the outline of a world where she had a place, and that outline was more than anyone had offered her in years. The storm did not let up. The lamp burned lower. The fire in the stove cast its red light across the table between them, and the evening went on past the point where evenings between strangers usually ended, and something shifted in the quality of the silence, and neither of them moved to stop what the silence was becoming. That night they crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In the morning nothing was said. There was no scene, no declaration. He woke before her and was already at the barn when the household stirred. She set the breakfast table and moved through the morning chores with her hands, doing what they knew to do, while the rest of her tried to understand what had changed. What had changed was everything. She did not yet know that it would show. 3 weeks later, Thomas Whitaker shook Caleb Mercer's hand at the gate and thanked him for his work. Caleb said the thanks were his. He looked at Elsie once across the yard, a look that was not long enough to be remarkable to anyone watching, and long enough to hold everything he could not say in front of her father. Then he rode north toward Pine Crossing, and the yard was quiet, and Nathan Reed appeared the following Sunday as though he had been waiting for precisely this. The weeks after Caleb left had a particular quality of wrongness that Elsie could not explain to anyone. She moved through her days the way you move through a room after the furniture has been rearranged in the night. Everything where it should be, nothing quite right. She read in the evenings. She helped her mother with the preserving. She answered Nathan's visits with her careful courtesy and told herself it was not cowardice to wait and see. Then, 5 weeks after Caleb rode north, she knew. She knew the way women on the frontier knew such things, without ceremony or confirmation. Just a body that had stopped behaving the way it always had, and a knowledge that settled into her chest like an anchor dropping through cold water. She sat at the kitchen table alone, morning light coming in flat and gray, the fire burning low. She did not cry. She pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at the knot in the wood grain in front of her and thought, "Here is a truth. Here is what you do with it." She tried to write to him. She sat with paper and a pen and the lamp and tried three times, and each time the words came out shaped like a plea, and she folded the paper and did not send it. She did not want to ask him for rescue. She wanted to tell him the truth because he was part of it, and see what he was made of. She was made of this. She would not hide. She would not let someone else manage her truth for her. She would not let Nathan Reed fold her into his idea of a solution. She would go and say it herself. One morning when the house was empty, she left a note on the table. "Into town, back before dark." And she walked past the near town without stopping and kept walking north. The road to Pine Crossing was 12 miles of frozen mud and bare-branched corridor. The rain started an hour in, the steady, cold kind that does not let you hope it will stop. Her skirt soaked through in the first mile and stayed wet. Her boots grew heavier with clay. She kept the folded paper with the address of the carpentry shop in the inside pocket of her coat, dry against her ribs. The first 3 miles she rehearsed what she would say. The middle miles she thought about her father, about the way he had built this life post by post, season by season, and what this news would cost him in the valley's estimation. She thought about that cost and did not turn back. The cost of hiding was higher, and it would be paid by the child. The last miles she stopped rehearsing. She just walked. The rain came down, the road stretched ahead, her breath made small white clouds and vanished. There was a kind of clarity in having already decided, in having nothing left to decide except to keep moving. She did not think about what he would say when he saw her. She thought about the next step and then the one after that. Pine Crossing appeared in the late afternoon, gray and small under the low sky. A feed store, a livery, a general merchandise, a church at the end of the main street, and at the far end, set back from the road, a carpentry shop with sawdust drifting out beneath the door. She pushed the door open. A small bell rang. The smell of pine and fresh shavings hit her first, warm after the cold, and then the heat from a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and then 3 men turning to look at her from their benches. The man nearest the door was older, a heavy-set man with sawdust in his gray beard. The 2 others were younger, both strangers, and then Caleb, at the bench farthest from the door, straightening from a long piece of wood, a hand plane set aside, his eyes finding her in the room with an expression she had not expected. Not surprise, not alarm. Something that looked, underneath the stillness of his face, like a man who has been waiting for a knock and suddenly hears it. He said something low to the older man, who glanced at Elsie and nodded once with the tact of a person who has seen enough of life to recognize its hinge moments. Caleb picked up his coat from the hook and crossed the room. He did not ask her why she had come. He did not ask about the rain or the mud on her skirts or the 12 miles she had walked. He said, "Come with me. My room has a fire." The room above the feed store was small and spare. A narrow bed, a table, a chair, a stove with a good fire already in it. A stack of boards against one wall, tools laid neatly on a shelf, and in the corner, near the single window, a cradle. Elsie saw it before she had fully taken off her coat. She stopped moving. It was pine, pale, and fresh-smelling. The runners were curved in a gentle arc at each end. The headboard had been shaped into a smooth curve that reminded her, without being told to, of a hand cupped to hold something small. There was no decoration, no name, no date. Just clean joinery and careful work, the kind that would last. Caleb said, from behind her, "I made it every evening since I left the valley. I wasn't sure. I didn't have any right to be sure. But I kept thinking, if that night meant what I hoped it meant, if something had come from it, I wanted to have something ready." He paused. "I didn't write because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me an answer. I thought if I was wrong, the cradle wouldn't hurt anyone. And if I was right, I'd rather you came to me yourself than come because I asked." Elsie stood with her wet coat in her hands and looked at the cradle and understood something she had not been able to name during 12 miles of walking in the cold. She had come to say the truth, but the truth had already been said, not in words, in pine and plain and the hours of evenings when a man who did not know for certain had decided to act as though he did, because the alternative was to do nothing, and he could not live inside that kind of nothing. She turned to look at him. "You were right," she said. He closed his eyes for one breath. When he opened them, he crossed the room and knelt beside the chair where she had sat down without remembering sitting, and he took both her cold hands in his and held them. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire speaking softly in the stove and the rain coming down outside and the cradle standing in the corner, waiting as it had been made to do. That night, while Elsie slept by the stove, worn through to the bone, Caleb sat at the small table and wrote 2 letters. Before he put pen to paper, he leaned over and said quietly, so as not to wake her, "May I write to your parents, both of them?" She opened her eyes. "Yes." He wrote for a long while. He did not ask her what to say. He wrote what was true. To Thomas Whitaker he wrote that he would not pretend the situation had come about in the right order, because it had not. He wrote that he had left Ash Creek intending to return with enough saved to ask properly, and that he had not moved fast enough, and that was his failure, not Elsie's. He wrote that he understood if Thomas did not want him in the family. He wrote that he was asking for the chance to talk like one man to another, and that he would not blame Thomas for any answer he gave. He signed it with his full name. To Miriam Whitaker he wrote shorter. He wrote that her daughter had walked 12 miles in the rain rather than be silent about the truth, and that he hoped she would not have to be alone in what was coming. In the morning, the rain had eased to a cold mist. They walked the 12 miles back to Ash Creek together. He carried a small bag with what he needed for however long this took. She walked beside him, and the road was the same road it had been the day before, but she was not alone on it. Thomas Whitaker was in the yard when they came through the gate. He had known Elsie's note was a lie within the hour of her leaving. He had known, from the weight of the weeks before, that something had been building that he had not been told about. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face the way it went when he was controlling it, and he watched his daughter and the carpenter walk up the road together. Inside the cabin, Miriam set a kettle on without being asked. Thomas read Caleb's letter at the table. He read it through once. Then he set it down and read it again from the beginning. Elsie sat across from him and did not look away, which was the hardest thing she had done in 17 years. Her father looked at her a long time. Then he looked at Caleb. "Sit down," he said. "We have things to talk about." The talking took most of the afternoon. Thomas was not gentle. He was not cruel either, but he was thorough. The way a man is thorough who has built everything he owns on honest ground and expects the same of what he allows into it. He asked about the work in Pine Crossing. He asked about the money. He asked about the plan, not the hope, the plan. He asked whether Caleb understood what he was asking to take on, and whether his word had ever meant the same thing twice. Caleb answered every question. He did not embroider. He did not promise what he could not guarantee. He said, "I cannot promise wealth. I can promise I will not leave, and that I will work, and that your daughter will never have to carry this alone." At one point, Miriam put her hand on Elsie's across the table, in plain sight of her husband. It was a small thing. It changed the temperature of the room. They were still at the table when hoofbeats came into the yard. Nathan Reed entered without knocking, which was not a thing he would have done if he had understood what kind of room he was entering. He had heard the talk that moved through the valley like water through rock. He had put things together. He stood in the doorway of the Whitaker cabin in his good coat, with his rehearsed expression of reluctant generosity. "Thomas," he said, "I heard there was a situation. I thought, given the circumstances, there might be a way to handle this that keeps the family's name out of the damage." He glanced at Elsie. He did not look at Caleb at all, which was its own kind of statement. "I'm prepared to step in," he said. "Make it proper." The child's name would be Reed. The talk would stop. The girl would be settled. He paused. The carpenter would need to move on, naturally. Thomas Whitaker said nothing. Miriam said nothing. The room was very quiet. Elsie stood up. She was 17 years old, and her dress was still showing the mud from the road, and she had not slept properly in weeks, and she was more frightened than she had ever been in her life, and none of that showed on her face. "I have been afraid," she said, "of what the valley would say about the truth, but I am more afraid of spending my life inside someone else's lie." She looked at Nathan Reed directly, the way she had never quite been able to before. "You are not offering to help me. You are offering to own me. Those are not the same thing." Nathan's expression went through several versions of itself. Caleb did not speak. He stood beside Elsie, and he was still and present, and he did not try to fight her battle because she was not losing it. Thomas Whitaker looked at the man in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said, with a flatness that was its own kind of verdict, "We'll not be needing you for this, Nathan." Nathan Reed left. He was not gracious about it. In the weeks that followed, he said in town that Caleb Mercer was a drifter who had trapped a decent girl, that Thomas Whitaker had lost his sense. The valley heard this and formed its various opinions, as valleys do. Some agreed with Nathan, some did not. Time would arrange the rest of it, as time arranges most things, around whatever proved itself solid enough to last. The wedding was on the first Sunday of January, in the small white church at the edge of Ash Creek. The congregation was not large. Some came from genuine goodwill. Some came to see how the thing would look. Elsie understood the difference and did not let it touch her. She wore a dress her mother had altered in 3 days of close work, gray wool with a white collar, let out in the right places and taken in where it needed to be. It was not a wedding dress. It was a good dress made to fit a woman who was exactly herself. Caleb stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was not fashionable but was clean, and his hands bore the marks of his trade, which he did not hide because they were not a thing to hide. Thomas Whitaker walked his daughter down the aisle. His face was the face of a man who had accepted something that had cost him and was still deciding whether the cost was right. At the rail, before he placed Elsie's hand in Caleb's, he stopped. He looked at the younger man. "Become the man you said you'd be," he said. Caleb met his eyes. "I will," he said. Elsie heard those 4 words, and something that had been held tightly in her chest for months released itself quietly, like a door finally on its proper hinge. The ceremony was plain. The minister was a plain-spoken man. When it was done, Caleb leaned in and kissed her once, gently, the way you touch something you intend to be careful with for a long time. Outside, the sky was the pale gray of winter in the valley, and the cold was sharp, and the year was new, and they walked out into it together. They lived above the feed store for the first year, in the small room with the stove and the pine cradle by the window. It was not comfortable, exactly, but it was theirs. Elsie learned the rhythms of a town smaller than a valley, but shaped differently, with its own edges and tolerances. She took in mending, and then alterations, and then dressmaking from whole cloth, and she kept the household accounts in a ledger she bought herself with her first month's earnings. The baby came in summer, a girl, born into the sound of the feed store below and the smell of sawdust and pine from the shop across the street. They named her Hope, which was what she had been all along. Caleb worked. He was good at the trade in the way some people are good at a thing, because their hands and their patience and their attention are all the same size. Briggs gave him more responsibility, and then more. The room above the feed store became a small house at the edge of town, rented first and then bought, because Caleb did not spend money he had not earned, and the money added up. They had winters that were lean. They had a season when the work dried up and they ate more carefully. They had an evening when Hope had a fever that stretched through the night, and both of them sat up without speaking, doing the small necessary things, and in the morning the fever broke, and they looked at each other across the sleeping child with the shared knowledge of what it was to be frightened for the same thing. 3 years after the wedding, Caleb bought a plot of ground near Ash Creek. He built the house himself, with Briggs's help, and then without it in the months between jobs. It was not large. It was square and well-joined and built to stand in the wind, which it did. The cradle went with them to every house they lived in. Hope slept in it. After Hope, the others did. The wood darkened slowly to the color it would always be now, and the runners wore smooth from the motion of many evenings, and the handprints of children who were grown left their invisible record in the grain. Elsie, 84 years old, looked at her great-granddaughter in the slant of afternoon light, and the question was still hanging in the air. Would you walk that road again if you had to? She looked out the window at the bare cottonwood branches and the fence line of a farm that had been in the family for 60 years, longer than some towns. That road was cold, she said. The mud was bad. I was more frightened than I have ever been before or since, I think. She was quiet for a moment, But at the end of it was a room with a fire, and a man who had spent every evening since leaving making something because he hoped I would need it. She looked at the cradle. If the end of the road is the same, I would walk it twice. The girl looked at the cradle. She looked at it differently now. The way you look at something when you have been told what it cost. He never put a name on it, the girl said. No, Elsie agreed. He said a thing built for a person doesn't need a name. The person's the name. The room held its quiet. Outside, a winter bird landed on the fence post and sat for a moment, small and deliberate, and then was gone. That cradle had held 5 children, 12 grandchildren, carried to it in turn for the blessing of the first night home. 3 great-grandchildren now, one of them sitting cross-legged on the rug with her chin in her hand. The wood had no inscription. It had something better. It had the shape of a man's belief in something he could not be certain of, built in the evenings of a rented room when certainty would have been the easier choice, and hope was all he had to work with. Some people declare their love loudly, in public, with witnesses and flowers. And some people spend their evenings at a workbench, shaping pine with careful hands, preparing for a truth that has not yet arrived to find them ready. Both are a kind of faithfulness. But only one of them will hold a child in the night, and only one of them, come to think of it, lasts. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.